The Egypt Game, Chapter 15. The Ceremony for the Dead. It was Sunday afternoon, and April, Melanie, and Marshall had just come down to get Elizabeth to join the boys in Egypt for a previously scheduled rendezvous. When Elizabeth met them at the door with her dead pet and tears in her eyes, it was only natural that somebody should think of a funeral. And when April and Melanie started tossing the idea back and forth, decorating and elaborating the ways they always did, it worked just the way it was supposed to. Elizabeth's tears slowed up, and a damp dimple flickered in her cheek. By the time the three girls and Marshall squeezed through the fence to Egypt, where Ken and Toby were already waiting, a great deal of the necessary background material was already beginning to take shape. Prince Ptahhotep, son of the great Queen Neferbeth, had just fallen in a battle with a terrible monster, and his body was being taken in solemn procession to the temple of Anubis, god of the dead. Ken and Toby were gratifyingly enthusiastic. In fact, Toby, who always had to be right in the middle of everything, insisted right away that he and Ken Horembeb, that is, were going to be the high priests of Anubis. "Now, just a minute," April said. "Melanie and I thought up this ceremony. We get to be the high priestesses of the dead." "You mean Ada? You and Ada?" Toby corrected. Just the day before, a rule had been passed that members should be called only by their Egyptian names while they were inside the land of Egypt. "Okay, me and Ada. Anyway, it was our idea." "Yeah, but I've finished reading a great book that tells all about what they did to the mummies and everything. So I've got some tough ideas." "So have I," April said. "Queen Neferbeth ought to choose the high priestess," Melanie said, interrupting the exchange of glares. "After all, it's her parakeet." That broke the deadlock. Elizabeth didn't want to decide against anybody, so she put a pebble in one hand and let them choose. Ken and Toby won and got to be the high priestess of Anubis. The first thing Toby did as a high priestess was to announce that the whole thing was going to take a long time. In real Egyptian times, he said, the preparation of the dead and the funeral ceremony took as much as 40 days. Theirs wouldn't take that long, but maybe it would last as much as 5 or 6. He said that before he could really get started, they were going to need a lot of supplies. So until he could get the things he needed, they might just as well go on with the procession to the temple. Melanie suggested that the procession needed palm branches and flower petals and that sort of thing. And of course, everyone thought of the trash bin behind the florist shop. So, a few minutes later, the entire population of Egypt was sneaking up the alley on the way to sort over the florist's recent rejects. As soon as they returned, loaded with loot, the procession got underway. Marshall came first, carrying the smoking incense burner. Next came Elizabeth as the Queen Mother and chief mourner. One of the curtain robes was draped over her head as a veil, and she carried a big bouquet of only slightly wilted dahlias. Then came April and Melanie as the mourning populace, scattering flowers and chanting, "Weep for Prince Ptahhotep, fallen in battle," in a high, mournful wail. And last of all came the 2 high priests of Anubis, carrying on a flower-strewn plank the dead body of Prince Ptahhotep. The procession wound its way back and forth across the storage yard several times and came to a stop in the temple. There the bier was placed on a specially prepared altar in the middle of the floor. At that point, the ceremony had to stop for fresh ideas. Since this was the first ceremony for the dead, there was no record scroll to follow, and it was necessary to stop now and then for discussion and new suggestions. Afterwards, of course, Melanie would make a record of the things that were done, and any future ceremony for the dead wouldn't have to stop and start. All the other ceremonies and rites had been developed in the same way. But this time there was a difference. This was the first new ceremony to be made up since the coming of the two new Egyptians, and first real ceremony they'd actually taken part in. April and Melanie had often wondered if they ever really would. But they needn't have wondered. The boys took part all right, and to an extent that nobody had expected. For instance, it was Toby who suggested that they march around the altar, beating their chests and sprinkling their heads with ashes and wailing. That wasn't so much of a surprise. He'd already demonstrated that he had lots of good ideas. It was the way he threw himself into the part that came as a shock to the girls. He was so different from what he was at school. At school, he was Toby the cool cat sophisticate. And now, suddenly, he was Toby the grief-stricken ancient Egyptian. And somehow, he gave the feeling there were a lot of other roles he could play just as well. Ken was a different matter, although he too did a lot better than anybody would have expected. He was, of course, absolutely perfect at being himself, and he was very much at home in the role. But this Egyptian business was something else again. And so while Toby staggered around the altar, beating his chest with wild-eye abandon, sprinkling real ashes left over from Set's sacrificial fire, in his hair, wailing like a wounded electric guitar, and while right behind him, April and Melanie did more or less the same things, just about as realistically, except they were using imaginary ashes. Because to a girl, even the death of a pharaoh isn't worthy of a dirty head. And while Elizabeth did everything April and Melanie did, only softer. And while even Marshall marched with solemn assurance, thumping his chest firmly with the hand that wasn't holding security, and making a noise like a stuck recording, Ken brought up the rear. The rest of them could do it. Ken Kamada could, too. And he did. But it wasn't easy. Every time he thumped his chest or made a brief, half-hearted wail, he felt his ears get hot. And from time to time, he announced to nobody in particular, "Sheesh, I feel like a kook." When 5:30 came and everyone was leaving, Toby told the other members of the Egyptian game to call him up that evening, and he would assign them something to bring. He was going to do some research, he said, to find out exactly what was needed to make a mummy. But there was an awful lot to learn about mummies, and even after a whole evening of studying it, turned out that Toby's information wasn't all that complete. For instance, when Ken, who was assigned to bring oil, wanted to know what kind, Toby couldn't exactly say. It didn't seem likely that the ancient Egyptians used any of the kinds Ken and Toby knew about. Crankcase, sewing machine, polyunsaturated, or bicycle. They finally settled for bicycle, because oil was oil, and bicycle was the only kind that Ken owned personally. When the Egyptians had assembled the next afternoon, bringing their offerings of oil and spice and salt and perfume, Toby Ramuse gave a little talk on how to prepare a mummy. It was a good speech, but it suffered from frequent interruptions because Bastet and Ida had read the same book and had some ideas of their own, and there was another pause while everyone tried to comfort Queen Neferbeth, who got all upset when Ramos spoke indelicately